Having studied at St Andrews University, where Adam Smith of Glasgow fame was our hero, no, I'm not overawed. Well, I have to say at the outset that being perhaps the only non-lawyer in a large group of most impressive lawyers, I feel a bit like Daniel in the lion's den, so forgive me if I get it wrong. Timo Minson has discussed a number of ethical issues relating to AI in a medical context. What happens when AI makes a mistake and goes wrong, how existing medical regulations will cope with AI, the tension between patient data privacy and the need for AI to learn from large-scale patient data, the effect of proprietary systems, whether AI systems should have legal personalities, the effect on employment and the potential for unequal wealth distribution, and the biggies, bias and discrimination. And as you noted, some, indeed many of these issues have wider ramifications than just the medical field, and I shall look at some of these same issues and one or two others in a broader societal context. Now, most of the ethical issues which arise with the implementation of AI systems are not unique to AI. Perhaps I should add parenthetically that we're not talking about the ethics of AI at all. We're talking about human ethics as related to the development and implementation of AI. I recently spoke in a debate at the Worship for Company of Information Technologists in London with Professor Richard Harvey, who's the Gresham Professor of IT and the Professor of AI at the University of East Anglia. On the motion, there's no such thing as AI ethics, just ethics. It became apparent in the debate that there are ethical issues which are specific to AI, or which AI renders materially more acute. And today I want to look at the main ethical issues that do arise in relation to AI and reflect on the extent to which they are legal issues too. I shan't, as one of the earlier speakers said, try and untangle the one from the other. I'm going to discuss 6 ethical topics: bias, explainability, harmlessness, responsibility for harm, the effect on employment and on society, and, as Katerina has just alluded to, AIs impersonating humans. And I'll also discuss the question, does ethics really matter in AI? I'm not going to talk about the trolley problem, because in my opinion it's boring, it's old hat, and it's not a real problem even for automated vehicles, and it was very clearly set out by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. It's certainly not new. He called it the doctrine of double effect. Nor shall I discuss the ethics of artificial general intelligence or strong AI, because quite simply, I don't think it's going to happen, parce Professor Hawking. So first, bias. Bias is definitely not unique to AI. As several speakers have pointed out, AI systems are biased because we are biased. Bias in AI systems arises from 2 main causes: unwitting bias in the minds of the engineers who design and build the systems, and secondly, bias in the data. The vast majority of these engineers, at least in Europe and the USA, are young white males. Nothing wrong with that, you may say, but perhaps they may not even be aware that they're designing systems that work really well for white males, but significantly less well for black females. Famously, a very sharp young black researcher at the MIT Media Lab called Joy Buolamwini was offended, understandably, when Google's facial recognition system identified her as a gorilla and did not recognize her as a human being until she put on a white mask. So she constructed an experiment with about 300 carefully curated photos of light-skinned males and similar numbers of light-skinned females, dark-skinned males, and dark-skinned females. The system was close to 100% accurate with the first set, the light-skinned males, in the 90% range for the second and third, and an appalling 66% for the last, dark-skinned females. When she published her paper, Google and Microsoft immediately changed their algorithm. Now, as you know, AI systems learn from the data sets they are trained on, and so any bias in the training data set will be learned. We are inevitably using anthropomorphic terminology, will be learned by the AI. Biases will be embedded in the data set, as I said, because we are biased in many ways, some of which we notice, some we don't. And then they go on learning from the data sets they operate on, which themselves will have embedded biases. The larger the data sets, the greater the incidence of bias. Does this matter? Not in all applications. In machine translation, you're interested in the quality of the translation in the target language. So Google Translate copes well with translating into French, time flies like an arrow, offering le temps file comme une flèche, but not so good with fruit flies like a banana, les mouches des fruits comme une banane. However, gender bias can creep in here too. Turkish has genderless pronouns. Google and other automatic translation engines, forgive my Turkish pronunciation here, translate o bir mühendis as he is an engineer, o bir doktor as he is a doctor, o bir hemşire as she is a nurse, and o bir aşçı as she is a cook. I would say that's offensive rather than critical. But bias certainly does matter in many ways. As has been mentioned earlier, and many will be aware, judges in several American states use an AI system called Compass to determine whether to grant bail to alleged offenders, and in Wisconsin at least to help the judge decide the length of the sentence. The system relies on a number of indicators which do not include race. However, it does take into account where the offender or alleged offender lives. And given the racial distribution of populations in American cities, geography becomes a proxy for race. So a black accused who may not reoffend, given his record, is more likely to be denied bail than a white man with a comparable record. Compass, developed by North Point, now Equivant, is proprietary, and Equivant will not divulge how it works. Perhaps they can't. This is surely unethical. And in the case of Wisconsin versus Loomis, which was referred to earlier, the defendant, Eric Loomis, was found guilty for his role in a drive-by shooting. Pre-trial, he'd answered a series of questions which were then entered into Compass. The trial judge gave Loomis a long sentence, partially because of the, quote, high risk score that the defendant received from this risk assessment tool. Loomis challenged his sentence because he wasn't allowed to assess the algorithm. The state Supreme Court ruled against Loomis, reasoning that knowledge of the algorithm's output was a sufficient level of transparency. A legal matter or an ethical one? Both, in my view. This leads to consideration of another important ethical issue which has legal consequences as well as more general ones, for instance in finance, and that's explainability. The most popular forms of AI today are, as we've talked about, based on deep learning through artificial neural networks. And it's a characteristic of such systems that they cannot explain how they reach their decisions, nor can their designers or developers. And this is known as the black box problem. They continue to learn once trained, and the problem persists. It's a principle of the common law that a judge must explain his decisions, or hers. If he's relying on a black box system to make or support his decision, he cannot fulfill that obligation. A legal and an ethical problem, I suggest. A comparable problem arises if a bank or mortgage company is relying on a black box AI to determine whether to grant you a loan or a mortgage. If it denies your application and can't tell you why, then you cannot change your application to enhance your chance of success. for instance by increasing your deposit, because you wouldn't know whether this would meet the system's objections. Many human beings and human institutions refuse to divulge their reasons, but these AI systems cannot do so. A uniquely AI-specific ethical problem. Work is going on to solve it and make them transparent, for instance at MIT Lincoln Labs, but so far no general solution is available as far as I know. Third, harmlessness. In 1942, Isaac Asimov published his laws of robotics in I, Robot. And the first was, a robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. AIs are tools, and any tool can be used for good or ill. A knife can be used to cut bread or stab someone. AI can be used for the benefit of mankind or to hurt people. The use of AI-driven drones, let alone stray ones wandering around Gatwick Airport, as lethal autonomous weapon systems, which Katerina referred to, is already controversial. Many at the United Nations argue for them to be banned, like chemical and biological weapons. Some nations, including the UK, argue against it. Undoubtedly, all the major powers are developing such systems, and a number probably deploying them already. Could a legal autonomous weapon system, abort a mission if its target had entered a hospital or hidden in a group of children? A drone weapon operated by a human could and would be aborted in such circumstances. I doubt whether an AI system could make such a sophisticated judgment. Similarly, would an AI-guided drone be able to decide in an emergency situation whether to crash land in a populated or less populated area? Again, possible, but I doubt it. Unethical? Yes. But ethics is not always the first consideration in military thinking. Definitely an issue in international law. Secondly, in the concept of harmlessness, facial recognition, very much the topic of the moment. An AI technology that can be and is being used by repressive authoritarian regimes to facilitate persecution. The most egregious example of this in the world today, by a mile, is the widely publicized use of facial recognition by the Chinese government to identify, arrest, and incarcerate over 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang in Western China for no misdemeanor other than being Uyghurs and Muslims. Totally unethical. We were there in 2016, and it pains us to witness it. The one positive note in this sorry tale is that the Trump administration is considering blacklisting 5 Chinese companies, including Mengvi, Zhejiang, Dua Technology, and Hikvision, which supply these systems to the Chinese government. More generally, the ethical issues raised by the use of facial recognition technology are gaining wide notice. It's useful and convenient that my PC recognizes my face so that I don't have to key in a password to access the machine. More significantly, it's enabled police to identify and arrest elusive criminals, including the suspect in a mass shooting in an Annapolis, Maryland newspaper office last June. But San Francisco has just banned its use by the police and public authorities without special permission, and a gentleman called Ed Bridges is suing South Wales Police over its use of the technology without his permission. He will argue that it is an unlawful violation of his privacy and his rights to free expression and protest, and that it breaches data protection and equality laws. It's interesting that he crowdfunded the lawsuit, so technology can be really helpful as well as harmful. AI can also be used for criminal purposes, to take over an autonomous vehicle, as we've already discussed, and turn it into a weapon, to attack infrastructure facilities such as telephone networks and power grids, and to gather the data to increase the effectiveness and frequency of such crimes as spear phishing. There are many comparable concerns in the Internet of Things. Obviously unethical, indeed criminal. The risks need to be assessed in such situations. What this concern emphasizes is the crucial importance of cybersecurity in relation to AI, as several speakers have already mentioned. This was well covered in an excellent paper entitled "The Malicious Use of Artificial Intelligence, Forecasting, Prevention and Mitigation," published in February of last year by a group of scholars who met at Oxford University the previous February. They identified that the growing use of AI systems would lead to changes in the landscape of threats. First, the expansion of existing threats. The cost of attacks may be lowered by the scalable use of AI systems to complete tasks that would ordinarily require human labor, intelligence, and expertise. A natural effect would be to expand the set of actors who can carry out particular attacks, the rate at which they can carry them out, and the set of potential targets. Second, the introduction of new threats. New attacks may arise through the use of AI systems to complete tasks that would otherwise be impractical for humans. In addition, malicious actors may exploit the vulnerability of AI systems deployed by defenders, so AIs attacking AIs. And third, change to the typical character of these threats. They wrote, "We believe there is reason to expect attacks enabled by the growing use of AI to be especially effective, finely targeted, difficult to attribute, and likely to exploit vulnerabilities in AI systems." In response to this changing AI threat landscape, they made 4 high-level recommendations. First, policymakers should collaborate closely with technical researchers to investigate, prevent, and mitigate potential malicious uses of AI. Second, researchers and engineers in AI should take the dual-use nature of their work seriously, allowing misuse-related considerations to influence research priorities and norms, and proactively reaching out to relevant actors when harmful applications are foreseeable. Third, best practices should be identified in research areas with more mature methods for addressing dual-use concerns, such as computer security, and imported where applicable to the case of AI. And fourth, we should actively seek to expand the range of stakeholders and domain experts involved in the discussion of these challenges. Fourth, responsibility. Timo addressed the issues arising when the use of AI in a medical context goes wrong. Of course, this issue is not limited to the medical field and is of undoubted interest to the lawyers at this conference. It may be argued that it is a legal rather than ethical issue, but in my view, it's both. It's most commonly cited in relation to autonomous vehicles, which, like doctors and human drivers, can kill people. As far as AVs are concerned, the UK Parliament passed a law last July, the Automated and Electrical Vehicles Act 2018, which has yet to be implemented. It assigned clear responsibility to the insurer in the case of an AV causing harm or death, assuming that the AV was insured. If not, responsibility lies with the owner. This should ensure that injured parties are compensated relatively quickly, while investigation of the root cause can take its time. The insurer is entitled under the Act to have recourse later to the manufacturer or developer of a failing component, subassembly, or software module. The Act also has provisions for example, failure by the owner to install safety-critical software updates issued by the manufacturer and unauthorized modifications to the software by the user. The Act does not cover the situation where an AV has been hacked and taken over by a hostile party, as I discussed before. Conceptually, however, the Act addresses the issue of the absence of a driver who can be held to account. Nevertheless, the ethical and legal issues of liability in other domains rests open as far as I know, though work is being undertaken by the EU Commission on potential updates to the Product Liability Directive to take more recent developments like AI into its ambit, as we heard earlier. Whether and how this will affect us, of course, depends somewhat on Brexit. Fifth, the effect on employment and the distribution of the benefits of AI. Will AI create new jobs or destroy old ones? Undoubtedly both. What are the ethical implications? Like industrial revolutions before it, going back to the first industrial revolution, the so-called fourth industrial revolution will first destroy jobs, replacing human operators by faster, cheaper, more efficient machines that don't take holidays, demand a pay rise, or fret about Brexit. In due course, they will create the demand for new functions to be performed by humans that we cannot now even envisage. The problem is the sequence and the unemployment that it will cause in the interim. We cannot really estimate the scale of either phenomenon. Some of AI's most ardent advocates say that there's nothing to worry about. This is wrong. At the other extreme, some have exaggerated the dangers and predicted an employment Armageddon, and this is unhelpful. We should be concerned. To displace people from work without helping them to find new work is unethical and harms society. What is to be done? Retraining is key. There are jobs that AI cannot touch. User interface design is a good example. Who should fund the retraining? Government, corporations, individuals? Probably some combination. There are some excellent examples of corporate endeavors in this area. AT&T's Future Ready initiative in the USA is a $1 billion web-based multi-year effort designed to last 5 years, which includes online courses, collaborations with companies like Coursera and Udacity and leading universities, and a career center that allows employees to identify and train for the kind of jobs that the company needs today and will need. By 2020, AT&T estimates that it will have re-educated 100,000 employees for new jobs with cutting-edge skills. To recruit those 100,000 would have cost a fortune. BT has a similar program, and the government-sponsored Institute of Coding, supported by BT, IBM, Cisco, Microsoft, and others, as well as 25 universities, and my own institute, the BCS, is a very positive initiative in this direction. We cannot sit idly by. There is another economic and societal ethical issue relating to AI, the risk that the benefits will accrue disproportionately to a privileged few, like us, while the costs fall on those lower down the social scale. There's no quick fix for this risk, but it's one that policymakers need to have in mind. 6, as Katerina referred to, AI impersonating a human. Is that unethical? Famously, Alan Turing devised the imitation game in the 1950s, now known as the Turing test. And the test was whether a machine could convince a human being that it is another human being. And if so, it's passed the Turing test. Now, until recently, no machine had passed the Turing test, although many human beings had failed it. However, at the Google Developer Conference last year, Sundar Pichai, the CEO, demonstrated an experimental system called Duplex, an AI that convincingly called first a beauty parlor and then a restaurant to make, respectively, a hair appointment and a table booking. Neither receptionist realized that they were talking to a machine. It was so realistic. It said, the right moments. This technology is now live and available from Google. Although the audience at the conference applauded the demonstration, the reaction on social media was that this was unethical. Not to identify that the machine is a machine is unethical. And as we've seen, the EU high-level expert group has stated that this contravenes one of their principles. So those are the 6 topics I wanted to cover. Let me now turn to the question, does ethics matter? My answer is yes, profoundly, and I would say that, but let me try and justify it. If the public concludes that AI or the use of AI is unethical, it will lose public trust. There are many examples of this happening, with or without scientific justification. GM foods has been rejected by the public, and scientifically there's no evidence to support that at all. The Boeing 737 MAX is another example, and there's plenty of evidence. To quote the EU AI high-level expert group, trustworthiness is a prerequisite for people and societies to develop, deploy, and use AI systems. Without AI systems and the human beings behind them being demonstrably worthy of trust, unwanted consequences may ensue, and their uptake might be hindered, preventing the realization of the potentially vast social and economic benefits that they bring. They wrote, "To help Europe realize these benefits, our vision is to ensure and scale trustworthy AI." And as Katharina pointed out, the group identified 4 ethical principles to which AI should adhere: respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. They noted that while many legal obligations reflect ethical principles, adherence to ethical principles goes beyond formal compliance with existing laws. And this is a cogent argument. Now, ethics is often seen as a bunch of don'ts. And certainly there are ethical threats that need to be countered, as I've argued. But ethics should be seen as a positive. We want to buy from companies that we perceive as ethical. People want to work for ethical employers. Academics want to conduct research in an ethical way. Being ethical should be, and I think increasingly is, seen as an important element of an organization's stance and strategy. And ethical considerations need to be front of mind in the development and use of AI at every stage, from conception through design and build to deployment and use. To conclude, I have considered 6 ethical issues in relation to AI: bias, explainability, harmlessness, responsibility for harm, the effect on employment and on society, and AI's impersonated humans. I have argued that ethics really matter if AI is to be trusted and the benefits of AI are to accrue to society. How does this affect the law? Self-evidently, any law, including regulation, should be based on ethical principles. Drafting good regulation is difficult in such a fast-moving domain. Excessive regulation runs the risk of inhibiting innovation, but the EU has shown itself to be adept at it and should continue, in my view, to set the standard. In this context, it's encouraging to note that 42 OECD countries have just, the day before yesterday, I think, signed an accord to support a global governance framework for AI. Quote, recommendations of the Council on Artificial Intelligence, Principle principles for responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI. It has no force of law, of course, but it's a good start if the signatories act on it. So for the lawyers here today, I think the message is clear. We must consider ethics at every stage, whether advising clients or developing or deploying AI in your practices or in the administration of justice. And that consideration must extend from the senior partner or chief executive all the way down the organization. In all matters relating to AI, ethics must come first. Thank you.
Well, my cunning plan this morning